All right, so we're getting close to 200 people on the webinar. Answers are still coming in, gumbo, limbo, and live oak. But I welcome you all to the webinar today, April 28th, 2022. You are a great group to tune in today because we have a wonderful presentation in store for you. A few housekeeping things to get going with. Our next month's webinar is with Dr. Chris Wilson, and he's going to be talking about the rhizosphere, which is where the roots are of the plant. So we're going to be having a follow-up that is from our conference back in October. So there will be some reading material sent out before that webinar. And remember to use the chat box for asking questions for speakers and not for side conversations. And you are also welcome to use the question and answer as well. And so I have a picture of a Royal Poinciana here. And I don't know if you all know this, but my dad was a pretty good horticulturalist. And he said, you don't want to plant a Royal Poinciana in your tree. You want to give it to in your yard. You don't want to plant a Royal Poinciana in your yard. You want to give it to your friend or your neighbor from across the street so you can really appreciate the beauty of it, or have a really big yard. I did want to remind you that the Master Gardener Conference is annual conference is happening in person October 16th through 19th, and we are still in the planning stages, gathering our sponsors, but you will be getting information a little bit along the way as we are getting closer, and there will be an online option as well. So I did want you to know that. And the theme color this year is sunflower, so that's going to be fun for us to have a good time with. And thank you for keeping up with your Better Impact. Our Better Impact administrators attended a training last week, so we're learning even more as we're going forward, and we have a couple other administrator trainings going on in the next month. So there should be some new things going on with Better Impact as well. Oh, I can't believe I did this. Jamie, don't hate me. Our presenter today is Jamie Daughtery. She is from Lake County. It is not Evan B. Hang on. And she is a Master Gardener Coordinator in Lake County. She started there not long ago, so it hasn't been long that she's been with us, and she's just been doing an excellent job. And we are so appreciative that she's here with us today. She is located in Leesburg, Florida. She is a former New York City arborist, and that is why we selected the special question today, what is your favorite tree? She also has been a college instructor over in Central Florida as well, and she is a current PhD student at UF in the Department of Environmental Horticulture, and she's working with one of our favorites, Sandy Wilson. So I have stopped sharing, and Jamie, I am going to invite you to unmute and share your screen, and we will be off and running.
All right, hang on, I've got notifications and things to move out of my way really quick. I'm putting you guys over there. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Yes, I've actually been a certified arborist since 2010. I worked in New York City. I worked with utility forestry. I've done a lot. But I thought I'd tell you, it's hard for me to pick my favorite tree. I made a list of my top 8, but since we're going with tattoos, the 3 that I have tattooed on my body are live oak, Sequoiadendron giganteum, or giant sequoia, and Tabebuia bahamensis, because that was the first Latin name I ever learned. And that was a very awesome trip. So today I'm going to talk to you about the changing of plants over time. So we're going to focus on kind of the 4 major evolutionary feats that each of the major plant groupings took over time. This could be literally an entire semester class, because I used to teach this as part of a botany class for a whole semester. If you want more information, I do have coming up with a couple of other extension agents. We're doing a 6-session class. There's a session, like a part 1 and a part 2 of it. It's a little bit more in depth than botany. The first section comes with the book, The Nature of Plants, an introduction to how plants work. And we're going to look at more detailed about secondary growth, how does wood form, about the structures and functions of plants. flowers, fruit, and dispersal. And then the second section comes with the book, Soil Science for Gardeners. And we'll go into more in depth about plant nutrition. We're going to go into ethnobotany and then plant movement and chemical communication. So once I have all those flyers ready, I'll be sure to send them on to Wendy. So if anybody's interested, you can sign up. So let's talk about the changes of plants over time. Now, has anybody noticed a theme to the pictures up there by chance? And you can write in the chat. I'm going to ask you lots of questions and you can write in the chat and see if you get it right. I can't see the chat anymore, so I'm just going to give you a few seconds to write and then I'll tell you the answers, okay? So these pictures are from the major plant groupings that we're talking about today. So the first one is from our bryophyte group. Then we have our seedless vascular plants. Then we get into our gymnosperms and then our angiosperms, which represented here are our monocots and eudicots. There's more in the angiosperms, but there's only so much room for photos. All right, let's get this working. Hang on, it doesn't want to move. There we go. All right, so I've got some learning outcomes for you today. So by the end of this, if you didn't already know how to distinguish between monocots and eudicots, you will be able to. And just to let you know, eudicots and dicots, they're kind of interchangeable terms. So if I switch between them by accident, it's the same thing. You'll also understand the major plant steps in plant evolution. And you should be able to identify some key characteristics in those major groups that took those steps. So I'm going to start off with some basic definitions that you all should know. It's to kind of wake up your brains and get you typing what you think the answers are. And then we'll talk about those stages within plant evolution. And while talking about those, I'll also talk about briefly the major plant groups. The goal is to keep it about 45 minutes so that you have questions. So it won't be as in-depth as all of us want because I don't have 16 weeks. So let's get going. First up, definition. I'm going to ask you guys, what is a plant? There's a lot of things that can define a plant. Wait, I don't want that over there. There we go. Anybody? What's a plant? A couple more seconds, and then I'm going to tell you.
Ann Schrader says a living, breathing organism. A growing entity, says Karen.
All
Janice
right.
says an entity that does photosynthesis. Leslie says something that gets energy from the sun.
All right.
Those
are all really good.
Yeah, photosynthesizing organism.
You're close on all of those. So let me get back to where this will work. Come on. I gotta quit clicking on other screens. So to start off, it's a multicellular organism. Okay, that's the first step. And in general, they create sugars from sunlight via photosynthesis, but not all of them do. Because remember, we have some parasitic plants that don't have any chloroplasts in them whatsoever and do no photosynthesis, but they're still plants. They're really cool. All right, and it's basically made up of a shoot and root system, right? You have the shoots above ground and you have the roots below ground. And that's different than if you look at the algae and what they're made of, you know, and anything else. Like obviously mushrooms aren't plants or animals, but plants generally photosynthesize, always have shoots and roots somewhere along the way. All right, so what is botany? Anybody?
Study of plants, study of plants, study of plants.
Scientific study of plants specifically. And it can include things like classification, evolution, anatomy, morphology, physiology, uses of plants. It's really quite all encompassing. So we get into one that everybody here should know as well. What is horticulture? Because horticulture is different than botany. Cultivation of plants. Good job. So it is the art and science of cultivating plants, and it includes ornamentals, fruit, vegetables. So it basically just takes the practice of botany into the practical setting, and you're doing hands-on with it and, you know, making it beautiful and providing food for everyone. So we're going to go ahead and get into plant evolution. There are 4 major stages we'll talk about. And at some point, I'll say the sort of 5th stage. The reason I don't have it separated into 5 is because the 5th stage, this particular evolutionary feature pops up in a lot of different groups at a lot of different times on the time scale. So you can't really clump it into one specific group of plants did this, because a lot have done it. And if you want to take a guess at what that is in the chat, you're welcome to, but I'm not going to tell you the answer until later. So all plants go through what's referred to as a sporic life cycle. And if you look at this graph and you get stressed out, don't worry, it's fine. It's just here to show you what the basic sporic life cycle looks like. So all plants have a sporophyte and a gametophyte. The size and functionality of that stage changes as you go through time. The first group we'll talk about has a dominant gametophyte stage and a sporophyte stage that's dependent on the gametophyte. Then we move into having a dominant sporophyte stage where the gametophyte is dependent and even independent of the actual sporophyte itself. So plants all have a sporic life cycle, which is something else that connects all of the plants together. So we're going to go with the first stage in plant evolution. I want to give you time to guess what that is in the chat. And while we're doing this, I do want to remind you that plants evolved from green algae. That might help you with what you think the first stage in plant evolution is. Don't see any guesses yet. So we're going to get into it. It's the establishment on land. Now, plants were not the first organisms to establish life on land. Fungi, and there were even some algae that made it to land first, including lichens, where lichens are a combination of fungi and algae in a symbiotic relationship. So that makes sense, right? So it's that establishment on land. And each time we talk about one of these, we're going to talk about challenges and adaptations. So you're welcome to write in the chat, guess what you think the challenges are, and then also guess what you think the adaptations are. So if plants have come out of the water and they're on land now, what do you think the first major challenge they're going to face is? I like that. I see not enough water. It's dry, right? It's dry when you get out of the water, and that can be a problem. So what's something you think could be an adaptation the plants are going to be able to take on that will prevent them from drying out? It's a really simple adaptation too. Develop pores? Not yet. They don't have pores yet. No roots yet, and no vascular system yet. You guys are jumping ahead a couple of plants. These are really simple. They stay close to water and they stay small. That's the first step. They stay low to the ground and they stay close to water. You'll still find this plant grouping closer to water or very wet environments. So the next challenge is reproduction. Reproduction's been in the water, so everything can float to each other. Now it's not, you're not in the water. What are we going to do? We haven't attracted bugs yet because there aren't any bugs yet. Wind, ways to disperse. So actually, water is still required for reproduction in these earlier plants. So that's another reason they stay low and close to the ground. And if you look at the structures closely on some of them, some of the plant groups, they actually require raindrops to hit a specific location correctly, splash up and hit another location correctly so that the sperm can fall down to the egg. It's really complicated and amazing, but it's also a little bit crazy. So at this stage, you have that dominant gametophyte life stage. So what we're talking about right now are our non-vascular plants, and those include our liverworts, mosses, and hornworts. And often these three together will be referred to as the bryophytes, despite the division bryophyta only including mosses. So sometimes you'll hear, the bryophytes, and they mean all of them. Sometimes people say bryophytes and they mean mosses. If you're confused, just use liverworts, hornworts, and mosses, and then it'll be really clear. So what do those look like? We have our liverwort over here. Hold on, laser pointer. So this is our liverwort, and this is the one that this can reproduce both sexually and asexually. So it gets two different structures on it. So this green part here is referred to as the thallus, and it's that for all of these, it's the thallus. And this is the gametophyte stage. And you'll get these little cups that unfortunately weren't present when I took this photo, but you get little cups on them, which is the asexual reproduction. But then you get these little umbrella structures that is the sexual production part. And you have one that's like a cup that will take the drip from the rain. And then you have one that's like an umbrella that the drip splashes up on. And it's absolutely fascinating. And And I have never found one that I could take a picture of, which makes me sad. I will be very excited the day that I can find that. Let's get this out of here. All right, and then we have our mosses. And the mosses, the green part is that gametophyte stage. And then this part on top is the sporophyte stage. If you wanted to grow mosses from spores, you can. You need to keep the soil wet, but not completely saturated in an area with diffused light. And it will take weeks before you'll see anything. If you have a dissecting microscope, you can look and you can see the single cell moving into multicellular, which is fascinating, but I'm guess nobody has that sitting in their garage. And then the hornworts are called that because their sporophyte stage looks a little bit like horns that you see here. Right? And now none of these have true roots. They all have rhizoids, not official true roots. And there's some structural differences internally that is what keeps rhizoids and roots being different. So from here, your key takeaway is the first step in plant evolution was the adaptation to be on land. It's a pretty big step. And it was the non-vascular plants that took this step. So if we have non-vascular plants moving onto land, what do you think the next major evolutionary step is going to be? And yes, liverworts do kind of look like dollarweed, but they are definitely not dollarweed. I'm just waiting for one response. You guys are over on my extra screen over here. All right, well, they've already set up house on land. There we go. Vascular tissue is next. So mosses actually have like a precursor to vascular tissue in them, which is why you may have noticed they're a little bit taller than the other plants and the liverworts and the hornworts. They didn't have true vascular tissue yet, but that's the next stage because what happens if you're taller, right? You can get more sun and you can outcompete your neighbors. So getting taller required the ability to transport nutrients, which is where vascular tissue comes in. And there are challenges, and it's really interesting with vascular tissue too, because there's challenges and adaptations, and then adaptations cause more challenges, which lead to more adaptations. So there's a lot happening in this one. So our first challenge obviously was to grow taller, right? Grow taller, get more sun, get more nutrients, outcompete your neighbor. And to do that, we came up with vascular tissue. Now, having vascular tissue and being taller leads to a problem. So if you're taller and you're larger, and vascular tissue involves evaporation of water, right? As the water gets pulled up through the vascular system and the gas exchange, you know, you've got to have things open. What can happen as a result of vascular tissue? Janice, eventually roots will be right. Easily dries out. Exactly, they're losing water. So what do we get to protect the leaves from losing water? Wait for one person. Wax on leaves, cuticle, exactly. We get the cuticle. Cuticle's great, this waxy coating that protects it from drying out. Wonderful, except now we can't do gas exchange because there's wax on everything. What comes next? Ways to breathe, how? Stomata, you guys are good. You get the stomata. So the stomata are those pores that are usually most prominent on the underside of the leaves, but some plants do have them on both the upper and lower part of the leaves that allow for gas exchange. And then, you know, obviously keeping them open all the time was a problem. So they developed ways that they could open and close based on the need of the plant for optimum survival. So you guys are doing good. And at this point, we have switched to the sporophyte being the dominant life stage. Now you do have a time when the gametophyte is temporarily dominant. So they sort of have this alternation of generations where you have gametophyte briefly, and then sporophyte takes over for the majority of the plant's life. Interesting story. I taught my friend's 3-year-old that these plants were called sporophytes, and they only call them sporophytes and not what the common name is now, which I think is amazing. And I'm just keeping that quiet for the moment to tell you what they are. So we've already done our non-vascular plants. We're moving on to those seedless vascular plants. And one of those plants is the fern. So yes, my friend's children just look at ferns and say sporophyte, even in class. It's great. So this is just showing you what that sporic life cycle looks like in a fern specifically. So I just want to walk you through this so you can see how the gametophyte is temporarily dominant. So let me get my laser again. So we're going to start here. Just ignore mitosis and meiosis if it stresses you out. I'm not going to talk about it. So we have our main sporophyte stage. We've got our rhizoids down here again. On the back of the ferns, we have our sporangia that houses the spores. And I apologize, the diagram is misspelled and I can't fix it. I don't know how that got through wherever it got through. But so you have your sporangia and then your spores in there. The spores break out and they'll germinate, and they germinate into the gametophyte. Now, if you ever see, this is microscopic, barely visible to the naked eye until it gets a little bit bigger, but it's a gorgeous shade of emerald green if you ever get a chance to look at it. So it's going to develop. And then on the underside, it develops the gametes. It's going to develop the female up here by that little like indentation of a heart pretty much. And the males are down by the rhizoids. So it's underneath, so water can still be used for germination. And those of you out there should know that ferns require more water than other plants in your garden. This is one of the reasons too, because they need that for germination. So the water underneath, just a little bit of moisture, will allow the sperm to get to the eggs. The egg's going to develop. And then as that egg develops, it comes out of that little indentation that looks like the indentation of a love heart. And that is the sporophyte coming up. Eventually the sporophyte takes over, the gametophyte vanishes completely, and you're left with the full adult plant. Now, ferns are not the only plant in this group. So we'll talk about a few different divisions. You have division Lycophyta, and everything in Lycophyta can be very easily confused with anything in the bryophyte category. So you have club moss, spike moss, and quillwort. They are not true mosses. They are not bryophytes. These are all something that is in the seedless vascular plant category. So club mosses are called club mosses because you have the sporangia come up here that look like little clubs. Quillworts, I guess people thought they looked like quills. I'm not entirely sure why they're called quillworts. And spike moss are really amazing. They have these really tiny, what are called micropyle leaves, which are absolutely fascinating, but they can make a good ground cover if you have enough moisture in an area. So not most places in Florida, but they're cool to have if you've got pots for them. So the next grouping, we have Maniliophyta. This used to be referred to as Pterophyta. If you ever learned taxonomy before about 6 years ago, you learned them as Pterophyta. If you've never learned taxonomy, they're Maniliophyta. So you have your whisk fern, and the whisk ferns are kind of cool because it's almost like ferns evolved and then de-evolved because they have no true roots and they have no leaves. So they're just these sticks, and they get these little yellow sporangia on them when they're ready, and they'll release the spores. And then you have your horsetail, and until they're ready to go to spore, they're actually just a stick that looks a little bit like a reed or a bamboo, only significantly smaller. And then when they're ready to spore, they have all of the little spouts come out. Well, they're not really spouts, but they come out and they have, again, little yellow sporangia at the end. And when they're done, they drop off. And then there's ferns. I have my favorite fern on here. It's resurrection fern, because who doesn't like the fact that it can completely dry out, get a little water, and come right back to life? It's just super fascinating to look at. Now, I'm wondering if any of you have ever wondered what the inside of a tree fern looks like, because I'm sure all of you have seen the inside of a palm. All of you have seen the inside of a tree, but the inside of a fern is really quite cool. I could have just said it in Latin. I don't know what I could have just said in Latin. I could have just said a lot of things in Latin. So this is the inside of a tree fern. So the cool thing here, and what makes it different structurally than if you're looking at like the inside of a palm, is the fact that you've got the petioles from the leaves that actually help with that structural support. And that is what all of those little kind of wavy indentations are. These are all the petioles from leaves over time, and that makes it structurally sound. And then in here, it does look a lot like a monocot with these scattered vascular bundles in it too. But the main difference, if you were looking at a cutting, is one, you would have a lot more texture and hairs on the outside. And two is just the presence of these shows you that they are there for structural support as well. All right, so your key takeaways here is the next major step was vascular tissue, but vascular tissue wasn't that simple, right? We got vascular tissue, we got cuticles, and we got stomata, all as a result of that major adaptation. And the seedless vascular plants took this step. So guesses as to the next one? Well, I mean, technically roots are now definitely involved, but it's not the next major feat that we're talking about. Not flowers, we're too early for flowers. Seeds. Seeds are the next major step. So we had spores before, right? And spores, think about it. How many spores are in the sporangia on the back of a fern? You can get millions. And then how many of those germinate? It's not a real high success rate. So seeds help increase the success rate. So we're going to talk about our challenges and our adaptations. So I already gave away that spores weren't super successful. They're not very good at surviving for a long time. They don't travel very far from the parent. So that's a bit of an issue. So the adaptation here is the fact that seeds can survive a lot longer away from the parent, which increases their rate of survivability and germination because they're alive longer. Okay. Now, if we've got seeds, what's another issue we might have with seeds? Protective covering. We have our protective covering now because we have seeds. That was part of the development stage. Unfortunately, we have to skip over some of the super scientific part. They get eaten nutrients. Okay, that is true. They get eaten and there are nutrient problems. But distribution is a problem. It's having to get them somewhere else, right? If they just fall under the parent's going to outcompete it in most cases. So the seeds can move farther to survive. And when we start looking at our gymnosperms, a lot of the seeds do have wings so that they can blow a little bit further. And some of them are just, at least were distributed by mammals at one point in time. That whatever distributed them doesn't exist anymore. And it's ginkgos, if you're wondering what I'm talking about. They can be transported by birds too. Okay, so we then have a problem too, extra energy for producing seeds, right? Why on earth did it become beneficial to spend all this extra energy on seeds? And the reason was they germinated better than spores, so you had a higher percentage of plants surviving. And fitness, the whole idea of survival of the fittest is that offspring are able to grow, get to reproductive stage, and then reproduce successful offspring. So the seeds just increased fitness of the plants, which helped to have gymnosperms take over for a time. So sporophyte life stage is dominant. Gymnosperm itself means naked seed because it's not enclosed in an ovary. And we know it's not enclosed in an ovary because the seeds are not produced from a flower. So we've done our non-vascular plants. We've done our seedless vascular plants. So we're on our seed plants, specifically our gymnosperms. So we have here our cycads, our ginkgos, our netophytes, and our conifers. So we have a couple of key features of gymnosperms in the life cycle here is that gametophyte life stage has been miniaturized. So it's all happening within cones at this point. So production of seeds and dispersal stage has started within this life cycle. And the transfer of sperm to ovules is now via pollen, which pollen didn't exist before we get to gymnosperms in the context of this presentation. So we're going to look at pines for just a second. So this is Pinus sylvestris, a sylvester palm. So we have different cone sizes. The smaller cones are the pollen cones, which we have up here. So the pollen blows around. It's part of the problem everybody has allergies with. It's oaks and pines at the same time. And then you have your female cones that can take several years to actually come to maturity. And what you look at inside is this is the inside of one of those little tabs on that cone. So you can see that you've got basically the ovules in here. It's going to get pollinated and eventually you get seeds that look like this. And if you've never actually seen pine seeds before, they have a strong resemblance to those maple seeds when they've got the wing on them, right? So when the cones open, these fall out and they have those wings. So they spiral just like those maple seeds do, and they're able to get to the ground gently and even disperse a little bit further. And what that looks like in real life is you've got these cones here. So again, with your male cone and your female cone, and here you can actually see some of those seeds that haven't come out yet, which is always exciting to me when I find cones that still have the seeds in them. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the different groups that we went with. So cycads are the first one. So cycads do have leaves that resemble palms, but they're not palms. Even though a lot of times we call them sago palms, they're not true palms. They do have nutritional deficiencies that are not dissimilar from palms, but there's a lot of diseases that'll impact palms that don't impact cycads and vice versa. There's only about 140 species of cycads alive on the planet today, and they are dioecious, so you have male and female plants. So what we have here is female on the left and male on the right. And these are cool too, because every year they produce leaves, but they just, sometimes they're vegetative. So the point is photosynthesis, and sometimes they're reproductive. So they make the cones. The males will make the pollen cone, and the females make these smaller cones that eventually develop those red seeds at the base of them. But if you take those and pull them apart, which I wish I had samples, but I don't right now. If you take these and pull them apart at maturity, you can actually see how they very much resemble the shape and structure of the leaves as well. Now, I can't talk about sagos without talking about the cycads without talking about the only native cycad in Florida, which is Zamia pulmilla, commonly referred to as coontie. So it's not as common in the wild anymore, but through horticultural practices, it's very common in landscapes, which is a great way for us to actually preserve a species that is, again, getting less and less prevalent in the wild. So these also have male and female plants, and they will, if you don't clean up the seeds, they will just keep reproducing. The seeds don't germinate very quickly, but if you want them to fill in, leave the seeds. If you don't want them to fill in, remember to take the seeds out. And just be careful, because any cycad wasps really like to live in them. So just be safe out there. Next up is our ginkgo biloba. It's the last species in this division. You may see ginkgos that have slightly different looking leaves, and that's because people have been working on basically taking genetic variations in individuals and trying to come up with specific looks and things. And if you ever buy one and they say we 100% guarantee it's a male, you don't know it's male for sure until about 15 years old. And by then, if it's female, you have the problem with the fruit. It's not true fruit, but it does smell awful once it's squished. If you have never smelled the fruit, consider yourself very lucky. But these are one of my favorite plants too. I absolutely love the leaves. And these have been around for a very long time. And I'm sure most of you have heard the story about how it was thought they were extinct in the wild, but they found them on a monastery in China. They weren't actually extinct in the wild. They were noticed at a monastery in China, and then they actually found more of them out in the woods. But they're a pretty cool plant. All right, division Coniferophyta. So this is all of our conifers. So if it produces a cone, like a pine, it's going to be in here. So Coniferophyta is referred to as our softwoods. Now, the softwood has nothing to do with how physically soft it is. It has to do with a couple of things. One, structurally speaking, at a cellular level, this wood is different than hardwood. And it tends to be more malleable. So it's a little bit easier to bend, which is why it's colloquially referred to as softwood. But that doesn't mean it's always softer. Some softwoods are way harder than hardwoods, and some hardwoods are way softer than any softwood. So same problem with common names, right? They don't necessarily mean anything. But conifers do make up 80% of the timber industry. Okay, it's most often used for pulpwood in paper, but a lot of the pinus species also have their sap used to make turpentine. And I do want to show you a couple of our native pines. I'm not going into all of them. I think I'm only going into 3 of them. So first up is Pinus clausa, which is our sand pine. So this is our shortest pine in Florida. It also tends to be our shortest lived pine. These don't have the same fire adaptations. Most of our pines are adapted for fire ecosystem to survive. These aren't adapted to survive. They're adapted to make the fire a little bit worse. So if a fire goes through, a lot of the adults will end up dead, but it does provide room for juveniles to come through. And it's about every 40 years or so, you'll get sand pines that kind of just go up in flames, and then you have a new sproutings coming through, sorry. Zoned out visualizing what was going on for a second. Now, it's not that you'll get a complete clear cut all the time and have an even age stand of sand pines constantly. That's not how it works, but you do tend to have a larger amount die at one point in time compared to our other pines. So next up, Pinus eleoidea, which is our slash pine. So from a distance, slash pine and longleaf pine can often be confused. So if you're looking at really large trees that are similar in height, Pinus eleoidea tends to have a flatter, at least a flatter side, if not a slightly flatter top compared to the longleaf pine. So you can see the longleaf is much rounder and even throughout. Now, if you're able to get a closer look, longleaf needles are far larger and the cone is also far larger. But if you're looking at them and they're over 80 feet tall, it's a lot harder to tell them apart. As with any tree, if you can't figure it out by looking up, look down, see what's on the ground. If you can find needles, cones, or any other distinguishing features, that can be hugely helpful too. All right, so cypress is next. This one is bald cypress, but we do have two different cypress. We have bald cypress and pond cypress. So they can live for well over 600 years. In fact, the oldest known bald cypress in the state of Florida was the Senator. It died at about 2,000 years old after it had a fire issue. And I believe the next oldest one is somewhere around 1800, but don't quote me on that for sure. So there are differences between pond and bald cypress. Pond tends to produce the knees. There is a difference in bark. Bald produces the knees. Bald cypress is also taller and has a whorled pattern to the needles, whereas the pond is flat. Now, both of them are deciduous and drop all their leaves in the fall. So if you're new and you haven't seen that yet, please don't worry, it's fine. They'll come back. All right, key takeaways here is the third major step in plant evolution was seed production, and gymnosperms took that step. Gymnosperm needs naked seeds and includes the groups cycads, ginkgo, and conifers. It also includes netophyta, which we didn't talk about because they don't occur in Florida at all. In fact, I don't believe they occur in the US. I think they're in Africa. There's very, very few netophytes left. Ephedra is one that you can find that, but it's a complicated one. So we just left that guy out for now. All right. Who knows what's the next evolutionary step? Slash and longleaf, yes, they can have the same number of needles in their sheaths. Flowers, exactly, guys. Flowers and fruits. So what do we think some challenges are that possibly led to the adaptation of flowers? What do flowers do, guys? Pollination, good job. They're there to attract pollinators. So pollination was a problem because with wind, you don't get 100% pollination. You never get 100% pollination. But if you have something taking pollen to your flower, obviously that's going to increase your chances. And even having a flower is kind of a location to catch things too. So we have flowers with specific adaptations. And obviously there are flowers adapted to different types of pollinators. There's flowers adapted for wind. There's flowers adapted for bees and butterflies and bats and birds. So there's all kinds of different things. So then you have a seed dispersal problem because now you've got more seeds happening in an individual location. And now you're looking at distribution. So then fruits help with that distribution. Now, fruits don't necessarily mean they're fleshy. You can have fleshy or dry fruits. There's a huge amount of categories of fruit. But if it comes from a flower, it's a fruit. It doesn't matter what it looks like at the end. It's still the fruit of the plant. All right, so those are our major issues there. Angiosperms means container seed, and that is because it is enclosed in a container of the ovary and then also within that fruit. And again, it depends on the type of fruit you're looking at. Now, I will mention here that fifth major step that we aren't covering individually is the production of wood. So the reason it's not separate is because conifers and ginkgos so far produce true wood. And then your eudicots within the angiosperm also produce wood, not to mention the magnolids. So it's a complicated structure that was vital for those plants to become large and successful. But again, it wasn't one specific plant group that did it, and it's not even linear along the timeline. So it's really an example of kind of convergent evolution where different types of organisms came to the same conclusion on how to deal with an issue. All right, so we've done our non-vascular plants, our seedless vascular plants, and we've done our gymnosperms. So it's time for angiosperms. Now there's a lot of things in the angiosperm group. You have your basal angiosperms, your monocots, your magnolids, and your eudicots. Now I do want to bring up the point that magnolids, the location of magnolids in the evolutionary timeline is still debated. Some taxonomists will put it before monocots because magnolids tend to have features of both monocots and eudicots, and some are now putting it after monocots. So it's an ever-changing categorization as we learn more. Now, I will say as we go through how to tell the difference between monocots and eudicots, which you all probably already know, if you ever see a plant that looks like it has characteristics of both, it could be a magnolid. It could be a basal angiosperm. It could be a gymnosperm as well. So remember, don't just get stuck on, it's not a monocot or a dicot. You know, what is it? If it's a tree that's causing an issue, it could be a podocarp. All right, so let's look at some of this in the real world. So basal angiosperms and magnolids together make up for about 2% of all angiosperms on the planet. And those examples are going to be your water lilies, star anise, magnolids, nutmeg, peperoniums. And the peperoniums are where you get your peppercorns from, if you were wondering. Monocots make up for 23% of all angiosperms. So your grasses, your orchids, your palms, bromeliads. And your eudicots, also known as pure dicots, are 70% of all angiosperms on the planet. So that's oaks, roses, cacti, mints, asters, and several more. Together, there are about 295,000 different species of living angiosperms on the planet, which is really cool. So here's an example if you haven't ever seen things like a star anise or an amarella. Here's some images of what they look like. I feel like most of us have seen a water lily at some point. We have our magnolids. Our example here is Magnolia grandiflora. There's lots of different magnolias as well in different sizes. This does produce wood. It's a little bit more of a primitive wood, so structurally it's a little bit different, but it's secondary growth and true wood. And then you have your Piperaceae. So this is the black pepper family. So the peppercorns are coming from these stalks that you're seeing here. And they're also just a gorgeous plant. Look at those leaves. How great would those be in a garden? They're really cool. All right, so we're going to go through monocots and eudicots as a refresher. Those of you that remember how to tell the difference, feel free to share in the chat and make sure we don't miss anything. So we've got flower parts in 3s for monocots, 4s and 5s for the eudicots, 1 cotyledon or cotyledon, depending on who taught you how to pronounce it, in monocots, and 2 in eudicots. And that's where those names come from. Monocots is short for monocotyledon. Dicot is short for dicotyledon. And that has to do with how many juvenile leaves are in the seed. Monocots have that parallel venation, whereas eudicots have that net venation. You have a scattered vascular system in monocots, and you have a ringed vascular system in the dicots. You have no secondary growth in monocots, and you do have secondary growth that leads to woody growth in the eudicots. So here's what that looks like by comparison. So again, within that embryo, you have 1 cotyledon, which is that first leaf that comes out. And down here you have 2. And if you ever wondered why seedlings can be so hard to tell apart, it's just because the cotyledons don't have defining characteristics. So it's not until you have your first vegetative leaf can you really start to see the characteristics of the leaves of that plant. With the exception of beans, because usually the seed is still stuck to it, and you can use that to help you identify what it is. So if you plant something, again, that's why it's important to label it, because you won't be able to tell the difference for a little while. All right, so here's just looking at those differences in the real world, because we all like to look at pictures of plants. So we've got 4 over here for the dicots, 3 over here for the monocots. A close-up of that net vein formation for the dicots, and then that parallel venation in the monocots. Now here we have a cross section. This is actually a 1-year-old tilia cross section. I took this. Oh, I didn't take this one. I have taken one of these. This is not one I took though. But we have the pith in the middle and then the vascular bundles in the ring on the outside. So you always have xylem in the middle. Then you have, anybody remember what that middle between xylem and phloem is? What's that called? Starts with a C. Cambium, thank you. So you have that cambium there, and then you have the cortex, and this is 1 year, and obviously the longer something grows and the more woody it gets, you start to get those growth rings as well. And then we have the cross section of a bundle from a monocot, and you still have on the interior will always be xylem, you'll have cambium and phloem, but it's just not structured the same, which means it doesn't function the same afterwards, right? So palms are wonderful, but they are not trees. And one of the important reasons to note that is that because of this scattered vascular system, they can deal with a lot more trunk damage than a woody tree can. Woody trees are a lot more sensitive to damage that can cause long-term problems, whereas monocots just kind of heal the spot and keep moving on. So our takeaway here is that that fourth major step in plant evolution was the formation of flowers and fruits. Angiosperms took that step. It contains many plant groups, and we gave you a refresher on monocot and eudicot differences. So at this point, you should be able to distinguish between monocots and dicots if you forgot how, understand the major stages in plant evolution, and be able to identify key characteristics in plant groupings that we talked about. And that is all I have for you today. I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, and that's what we're up to now.
Janice wants to know, why do you pronounce eudicot dicot?
Because when I was learning botany initially, that was the term that was used, and eudicot is a relatively new term compared to when I learned it. And like any of us as we get older, you tend to revert to what you learned first. So I'm trying to get myself to keep calling it eudicot, but I do slip back, which is why I wanted to give you guys that heads up. And the reason I slip back is because it is short for dicotyledon.
Right. And before we got started, Jamie and I clarified that because I had been doing some reading, and we are starting to see eudicot a lot more often. And she said that she would bounce back and forth between the two, either intentfully or not. She did. So that was good. Thank you for that. And so Elizabeth wants to know what are grasses, Jamie?
Grasses are monocots. And grasses are also fascinating because their apical meristem or growing area is at the base. So that's why cows can eat them and they'll keep growing back. If grass was a dicot, dicots tend to have their meristems at the end of branches, which means it impacts their growth structure when you cut them back.
Good. And Janice also asked, what about the moringa, the moringa tree, and katuk? She says, what are those?
I'm honestly going to have to look those up and get back to you. I don't know those two off the top of my head.
I'm pretty sure they're both eudicots.
I would imagine they're both dicots if they're woody plants.
I'm going to say eudicot because I'm throwing it out there today.
All right. Yeah, eudicot. Sorry, I keep doing that.
Roger said he's had a sago palm, quote unquote, for about 5 years, which is always vegetative and no evidence of male or female reproduction. Is that normal?
How big was it when you got it? Because they take a long time to reach sexual maturity.
All right. So we'll say that has not reached sexual maturity yet, and it does take quite a long time. Okay, let's see. Somebody wants to know if the Sandy Wilson we referred, if she was from Connecticut. No, she is from Delaware. And Mark Frank says that both the moringa and katuk are eudicots.
Thank you, Mark.
And what characteristic makes a pioneer plant? Siggy wants to know.
Oh, pioneer plants are great. So invasive plants are wonderful pioneer plants. So a pioneer plant is one that can go into a disturbed area and thrive, and they stabilize the soil. And then as they die, they provide nutrients into the soil, and then larger plants can come in. Normally, pioneer plants are smaller plants. So you're looking at lichens can be part of the population there. You can get mosses in that population depending on how close it is to water. But smaller plants come in, and as they die, you kind of move up to whatever that ecosystem is for that location. So you'll start with smaller plants, move on to shrubs, move on to trees, and it'll just stop wherever that ecosystem will naturally stop.
Great. And we have another question about what we think of, how do we think plants are going to further adapt and change to climate change?
That's a really interesting question. And we already have plants that do photosynthesis in different ways. So you have C4 plants, you have C3 plants, you have CAM photosynthesis. So some plants already have kind of a head start on what they can do as it gets hot, to where they can hold on to certain nutrients and then work on photosynthesis at night. So that's something that everybody's really looking into. At the moment, the main thing is moving range. So they're expanding their range, or the range is contracting depending on where they are.
Good. Someone wants to know, where do you think cattails fall?
Pretty sure those are monocots.
Yeah, and it's interesting that flowers, when you think about what a compacted inflorescence that is. Everyone is saying how great this was. And Jamie, if you will go ahead and send us a PDF of your presentation so we can post it online, and that way people can print it and refer back to it. Folks like the way you ask questions and put them on the spot, keeping them awake. And for the climate change, maybe our plants will learn to live in or adapt to more salty water or salinized water. And yeah, there's some good talk on mangroves, if you wanted to talk anything about that. If you wanted to mention mangroves.
I love mangroves.
Mm-hmm.
Mangroves are amazing. Red mangroves are island makers. The fact that they have propagules and not seeds is also fascinating.
Yes.
And what a propagule is basically a seed that starts to germinate on the parent plant. So when it falls off, it's ready to go the second it gets in the right environment. Yes. And I don't know, I feel like I need to be in a kayak talking about mangroves though.
Yes, that's required. And so Jamie, again, you're going to be doing a series of classes with fellow agents in the Central District on plant development, correct?
Yes.
Good. And we thank you for joining us. Did you want to tell us a little bit about what your PhD study is on?
Sure. So my PhD study is actually on the educational effectiveness of botanical gardens. Mm-hmm. So I am using my discovery gardens here, and come this summer, I will need people to come with data to help with data collection, as in taking the tours and telling me that whether or not you learned anything. So I'm comparing audio tours, docent tours, signage tours, and ultimately a virtual 360 tour to see if there's a difference in the amount of learning that happens with them. Because generally when you take a tour anywhere, if they give you a survey, it's about, did you like the tour, not did you learn anything? And I'm happy if you like the tour, but I'm more interested in if you learned something. Mm-hmm. And we actually have new signage coming to the garden that's going to be bilingual. The audio tour won't be bilingual at first, but eventually I do want to try to get some multilingual audio tours available as well. Same thing with the virtual 360. I'll just basically take the audio tour and overlay it on our images in the virtual tour, so that people that maybe are not mobile or schools that can't get out here can use those as virtual field trips.
Great. So just to let you all know, this will be happening at Discovery Gardens, which is located in Tavares, Florida, which is in Lake County, very close to Leesburg. It's a beautiful area. The gardens are about 3 acres, and she's comparing different learning styles, whether passive or more engaged learning styles, and as well as digital styles. So how people are learning. And so that's going to be happening this summer. You can contact Jamie Daughtery at the Lake County office. You can either email her there or give her a phone call and chat with the master gardeners too. And I understand that you have a plant sale coming up
on Saturday. Our big plant sale. We have over 3,500 plants and over 40 bottles of honey from our apiary. We start at 8 a.m. Our address is 1951 Woodley Road in Tavares, Florida. And I am putting my email address in the chat right now because I realized I forgot to put it on my last slide. Yeah. And I will stick our address in there too.
Great. What time's the sale start, and do you need reservations?
No reservations, 8 a.m.
Okay. And
we've already had I feel like we're going to have a line waiting to get in at 8.
Oh, I'm sure you will. Well, I hope you all have a wonderful sale, and please tell all the Lake County Master Gardeners I said hello, and tell Wanda I said hi to, and Meg and the whole crew down there. And I'm sure you all will have a great one. And thank you so much for your presentation. Everyone really loved it. They loved it as a refresher and kind of like really putting things in order in their brain. So thank you, Jamie. We really appreciate it. And we will see you next time.
All right. Thank you guys. Bye.
Bye.